5 years of marriage destroyed by 30 minutes, with a guy half his age, now he wants to ruin everything. I'm not sure why I'm doing this, making a post online while my real life goes to shit. Honestly, I've spent the last few days cooped up in this room, staring at the same walls, trying to make sense of it all. I keep replaying everything step by step, like if I analyze it enough, I'll find the one decision that ruined everything and maybe undo it somehow. The part that eats me alive is how good things were, right up until a few months ago. My life wasn't perfect, but it was good for me and it was mine. I had everything I told myself I'd never get, and then I threw it all away for no reason other than greed. Greed for attention, greed for something new, greed for the rush I didn't even need. I got the life I had out of pure luck, and I know that better than anyone. The marriage, the home, the small but happy little world I had, it wasn't supposed to happen for me. And yet I had it. I had him. And still, I betrayed him. I betrayed Oscar, the one person who gave me everything I thought I would never get. I met my husband almost 7 years ago, and back then, things were very different. For starters, and I'll be brutally honest here, I've never been the kind of woman who turns heads. I wasn't hideous or anything, but I wasn't the type of attractive that made men stop mid-conversation or try their hardest to get my attention. I was pretty plain, and because of that, work became my identity. My job was my child, my relationship, my everything. I worked at an accounting firm for over a decade, climbing each step on the ladder from intern to analyst and finally manager. It was hard, grueling work most days, but I loved it. It gave me purpose. Numbers made sense in a way people or relationships never did. But the truth is, my job also gave me an excuse. My tight schedule didn't leave room for much else. There was no dating, no late-night outings, no weekends wasted on brunches or shopping trips with friends. And even if it had, I wasn't the type of person to take advantage of it. I've always been an introvert. My life was a cycle: work all day, go home, rest just enough to drag myself back to work again. And for a long time, I told myself I was okay with it. I didn't feel like I was missing anything because I didn't think those things were in the cards for me anyway. It's no wonder my family had written me off. They made jokes about me never meeting anyone and ending up alone. I laughed along with them sometimes, but deep down I believed it too. And honestly, I had made my peace with that. I wasn't bitter about it. I had convinced myself that love just wasn't for me. That is, until I met Oscar. We met while I was at a conference I'd been forced to go to by my firm. It was one of those mandatory professional development things, and it was 2 full days of panels, networking, and awkward small talk. Not exactly thrilling, so plan was to linger on the sidelines, grab a plate of appetizers when I could, and show just enough face. Then, when it was late enough, I'd retreat back to my hotel room. That was exactly how I handled day 1. On the second day, I was going through the same routine, standing off to the side with a little plate of food, silently counting down the hours until I could leave again when Oscar appeared. He walked right up to me and asked if I came to the conference just for the food like he did. I remember laughing way too much at that. It wasn't even that funny of a comment, but it caught me off guard. He'd managed to sneak up on me, and I didn't know what else to do except laugh. At first, I honestly thought he might have been mocking me, but he didn't look smug or sarcastic. He looked completely genuine, like he was honestly just trying to strike up a conversation with someone who looked out of place. We talked for a while after that, and it felt strangely easy. He asked about my work, told me about his, and before I knew it, the time had passed faster than I expected. At the end of the night, just when I thought that would be it and we'd go our separate ways, he surprised me by asking for my number. I handed it over without thinking too much about it, but then he actually texted me. And then he texted me again and again. Soon we were messaging almost constantly. I wasn't sure what to make of it in the beginning. I hadn't spoken to a guy like that in years. I didn't even believe he was actually interested in me until he finally asked me out on a proper date. After that, things moved quickly. We went on dates. We spent more and more time together. Being with Oscar was probably the best thing that had ever happened to me up until that point. He was kind, attentive, and genuinely interested in me in a way I had never experienced before. I wasn't used to someone caring about me like that, and it was overwhelming in the best way. So when he asked me to marry him about a year and a few months in, of course I said yes. I didn't even hesitate. I couldn't imagine saying anything else. I'd never loved anyone like I loved him. I'd honestly never really loved anyone at all before him, and I didn't want to risk losing that. And Oscar, he was perfect. He really was. He was the perfect boyfriend, the perfect partner, and I knew he'd be the perfect husband the moment he pulled out that ring. And I wasn't wrong. Those first few years together were good, stable, passionate in a way I never thought I'd have. I was living a life I assumed I'd never get. Even my family was surprised. They didn't say it outright, but I could tell. They were impressed that I had found someone like Oscar, and more importantly, that I'd managed to keep him. Everything was amazing. I genuinely couldn't have asked for more. I had everything I thought I wanted: a good, steady job that paid well and gave me purpose, a husband who doted on me and made me feel loved, a nice home to share with him. It was almost picture perfect. No kids yet, but even without them, it felt like the kind of life people dream about. All I had to do was hold on to it. That was all I needed to do. But a few months ago, I failed. I let something get in the way of our marriage, and because of that, I ruined everything. It started off slow, so slow that I barely noticed it creeping in. At first, it was little things, the kinds of things you can brush off or blame on a bad day. But gradually, almost without me realizing, it grew into something bigger. By the time I finally recognized what was happening, it already felt too late. For a while, I tried to explain it away with anything I could think of. I told myself I was just stressed, that maybe I was run down from work, or that my body was trying to tell me something. For a brief moment, I even thought I might be pregnant. That would have been a simple explanation, something tangible to blame for my sudden irritability and mood swings. Maybe the hormones, maybe the physical changes, just something that could justify why I felt constantly on edge, why every little thing Oscar did seemed to annoy me. I hoped with everything in me that pregnancy would turn out to be the answer. At least then, I could point to something and say that's why I've been so off lately. I wanted badly for it to be anything other than me, but the test was negative. There was no baby and no excuse. Whatever was happening was coming entirely from me. The truth was that after years of marriage, after all the devotion and love he had given me, my attraction to Oscar was starting to fade. I knew how lucky I'd been to have him in the first place. I remember in the early days thinking that someone like him would never look twice at me, let alone marry me. But that didn't change what was happening. No matter how much I fought it, I felt myself pulling away. I can't fully explain why. Maybe it was in my head. Maybe it was a fear I'd been carrying for years that one day Oscar would realize he could do better than me, and that he'd leave. Maybe I thought if I started sabotaging things first, I wouldn't get hurt. Or maybe I truly just lost my attraction to my husband. It sounds ridiculous even typing it out, like an excuse more than a reason. But whatever it was, I let it bubble up until it started bleeding into our marriage in ways I couldn't ignore. At first, the changes between us were subtle. We still went about our routines, still talked about our days, still shared a bed at night. But I wasn't really present in the same way I used to be. I stopped reaching for his hand, leaning into kisses, laughed less at his jokes. All the things that used to feel so effortless. Soon the tension between us was palpable. Meals at the table went from easy conversation to mostly silence. Nights together in bed started to feel like we were on opposite sides of a canyon or something. We felt miles apart emotionally. Even the way we moved around each other in the house felt different, like we were strangers navigating the same space instead of partners. I think he noticed that I was acting weird and kept walking on eggshells around me, which only made things worse. It got to the point where silence felt safer than speaking. Anytime he asked if something was wrong, I'd brush it off, saying I was tired or stressed from work. It was easier to let him believe those lies than to admit the truth and tell him that my feelings were different and had skifted ways I didn't fully understand. Looking back now, I can see how unfair it was. He deserved honesty. He deserved the chance to know what was really happening inside my head and my heart. Instead, I bottled it up, hoping it would just pass. But of course it didn't. All it did was create more cracks and space between us. What stings most is that I let whatever was going on inside me affect my marriage, even when Oscar himself hadn't changed at all. He was still the same loving man he had always been. It was me who had changed. I was the problem. I thought I just needed time to get back to our relationship, time to fall in love with him again. I was working on it. I really thought I could fix things before Oscar brought up that something was wrong. But then something happened about 2 months ago that made everything worse. Like I said, I had worked at the company for a long time and was already a manager. I'd completely forgotten that I'd applied to this intern trainee program the firm was doing. The idea was simple in that higher-up employees would mentor fresh graduates who had been accepted into the program. I hadn't even taken the application seriously. I signed up because everyone in my office was doing it, and I thought might as well, just to be part of the group. Honestly, I didn't expect to be chosen. Yes, I'd been at the firm for years and I knew my stuff, but I was not the kind of person they usually picked for things like this. I wasn't exactly approachable. Social interactions weren't my strength, and especially not with people much younger than me. I figured they'd overlook me, that I was the obvious exclusion. But to my surprise, I ended up being the first pick. And that's how I got paired with Timothy. We met the day they announced the pairs, and my first impression of him was not great. I was honestly overwhelmed. He was bright, overeager, and immediately off-putting. He was cheery all the time, almost to the point of being irritating. What threw me most was that he actually seemed excited to be in finance, which wasn't normal in my world. He was fresh out of school, just 23. That put him nearly 20 years younger than me, and almost 30 younger than Oscar. There was just no way I could relate to him. I was in my early 40s, married, settled into routines, while he was barely starting out. He still carried the kind of naive optimism you only have before life kicks you down a few times. Because of that gap, I kept things strictly professional. I focused only on the basics of the job, the skills he needed to pick up. I didn't ask personal questions. I didn't encourage small talk. A lot of the other interns were practically becoming friends with their mentors, grabbing drinks together after work or gossiping about office politics. But I wanted no part in that. I set boundaries and thought that would be the end of it. But Timothy wasn't like me. He seemed intent on getting us to be friends. He'd stop by my desk, even on days when he didn't need guidance. He'd ask about my favorite coffee order and then show up with it the next morning. He remembered little details about me that I hadn't even realized I'd mentioned. And slowly, over time, I started softening toward him. It wasn't anything major at first. A short laugh when he made some silly remark, a bit of casual chit-chat before getting into the actual work, a moment where I didn't shut him down when he lingered in my office. It felt harmless, even though deep down I knew it was crossing lines I shouldn't have been near in the first place. One afternoon, though, he caught me completely off guard. We'd been talking about one of the firm's tougher clients, nothing out of the ordinary, when he just looked at me and said, "You know, I think you're really attractive." I froze. I honestly didn't know what to say. I remember laughing nervously because I thought maybe he was joking, but he wasn't. He said it so plainly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I should have shut it down immediately. I should have reminded him that I was his mentor, that I was married, that it was inappropriate, but instead I felt this strange mix of emotions. I was flustered, confused, and kind of flattered. God, I know I sound like a juvenile idiot, blushing over a boy half my age, but it's that people had never really said things like that to me. I'd gone most of my life without being the kind of woman men openly desired. To hear it from him, from someone so much younger, it did something to me. After that, things shifted. He didn't push, not really, but there was this unspoken connection between us. He'd linger a little longer in my office. His compliments slipped in more often. He'd brush against my shoulder when leaning over to look at documents. It was subtle enough that I could still pretend I was keeping things professional, but inside I knew it was heading somewhere dangerous and completely inappropriate. I told myself over and over that I wouldn't let it get that far, that no matter how flattering his attention was, I wasn't going to risk my marriage. But that resolve crumbled one night. It was late, the office was nearly empty, and Timothy was still at his desk working. I was packing up when I got a message from him. He said it was too late to make the long drive to his place and asked if he could crash at my place for the night. My first instinct was to say no, and I almost did. But then I remembered that Oscar was out of town on a work trip, and Timothy did live really far away from what he'd told me. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told myself it was just one night, just me doing a favor for an intern who was also kind of a friend. When he came over, I tried to keep things casual. We made some food, sat in the living room, and ended up talking for hours. He asked about my life, my past, things I hadn't talked about in years. I also asked about him and why he studied accounting and insurance. It felt strangely easy, not just talking but also being around him. And then, at some point, the distance between us disappeared. He leaned closer, and before I even realized it, I let him kiss me. That kiss turned into more, and by the end of the night, I had crossed a line I swore I never would. We slept together. The reality of what I'd done didn't come crashing down until the next morning, when I woke and saw someone other than my husband sleeping beside me in bed. The panic hit me like a wave, and I rushed to kick him out of the house. I told him to leave. I couldn't even look at him. The guilt was immediately overwhelming. The next day at the office, I put in a request to be removed as his mentor. I told HR it was a scheduling conflict, but the truth was I couldn't stand to be around him anymore without thinking of what I'd done. The guilt consumed me after that. I threw myself back into work and into trying to play the role of a devoted wife whenever Oscar got back home. I was terrified he would notice something was off, terrified he would put the pieces together. But he didn't, not for a few weeks at least. And those weeks were full of me being paranoid and worried. Each time he asked about work, I would wonder if he had heard something. He knew about the mentorship program and that I'd been assigned someone, but since I barely ever brought it up, so he didn't either. The guilt I was feeling was awful. I could barely concentrate on my work in the following weeks because of how bad I felt. Every text from Oscar, every call where he told me he missed me, reminded me of the worst mistake of my life. I could barely eat, I could barely sleep, and all I could think was how I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. I told myself it had to be a one-time mistake, that it would never happen again. Told myself that if I could just make it through without Oscar finding anything out, then I'd be in the clear and I'd work on our marriage. I'd be devoted and love him more than anything. I mean, I already did. What happened with Timothy was just an awful lapse in judgment. I made all these promises to myself, but I never even got the chance to make good on them because just a few weeks after that night with Timothy was when everything went to shit. And it was all because of a phone call. A call I was too stupid, maybe even too hopeful, to decline. Timothy called me. I hadn't spoken to him in the weeks after I dropped him. I shouldn't have picked. Maybe if I'd have let it ring, my life wouldn't be ruined right now. The second I picked up, he told me that he was leaving the program early, and then he started saying all this nonsense about how he was in love with me and about how he wanted us to be together. I wasn't sure what I was expecting when I answered, but it wasn't that. I told him that he was delusional and too young, that he didn't need to leave the program, he was just confused, that what happened couldn't happen again, and that he could never call me again. Then I hung up. I thought that was it, that I'd finally closed the door on whatever that was, but I had no idea that Oscar was standing behind me. I'd tried to whisper all my responses while on the phone, but I knew he'd probably heard them regardless. Calmly, he told me that we needed to talk. I rushed to try to explain myself, to lie that Timothy was someone else. But before I could, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. I immediately recognized it. He told me that he'd found it under Kitchen Island the night before. The ring belonged to neither of us. It had some strange anime character on it, for goodness sake. That, coupled with the conversation he'd heard, took away any possibility of me maintaining my innocence. I had no other option but to come clean and tell him everything. I told him about how I'd been feeling about him for months, and how the thing with Timothy snuck up on me, hoping he would understand. He didn't. He was disgusted. He couldn't believe that I would not only betray him, but with someone so young enough to be our son. He was completely appalled by the whole thing and me. He could barely even look at me after all that I confessed, and that broke my heart more than anything. I tried to get to stay, to talk to me, so we could work things out, but he didn't even listen to me. He just rushed out of the house like he physically couldn't be around me anymore. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. I didn't hear a word from Oscar. Not a call, not a text, not even an acknowledgement that I still existed. I didn't hear from Timothy either, not that I wanted to, but the silence from both of them only made the pit in my stomach worse. Every night I barely slept, just waiting for the sound of keys in the lock, telling myself that maybe Oscar had cooled down enough to come home, that maybe we'd get the chance to talk. but nothing. Instead, about a week later, an envelope showed up at the door. It was divorce papers, just like that, with no conversation, no fight, no last chance. He'd made his choice. Hours after the papers came in, I also got an email from HR about a mandatory meeting. The timing alone told me what it was about, and my chest tightened so badly I almost couldn't breathe. My worst fears were confirmed when I walked into that conference room and saw Timothy sitting there. Luckily, they didn't drag it out. They told me that due to my inappropriate conduct with a younger intern, I would need to clear out my office immediately. My years of service didn't matter. My history with the firm didn't matter. None of it mattered. I tried to defend myself, to explain that it had only been one mistake and that I had already pulled myself out of the mentorship to avoid exactly this. But it was useless. Their minds were made up. Timothy had clearly said his piece, and whatever he told them was enough to get rid of me. I had no choice but to nod and excuse myself. I packed up my things quietly, and I tried to not cry, but it was no use. I could literally hear people I worked with for years whispering about me. I couldn't even look anyone in the eye. I'd been there for years, practically built my life around that place, and now I was leaving like I was some kind of criminal. My career, my reputation, everything I had worked for was gone all in one morning. I couldn't shake the thought that Oscar must have had a hand in it. How else would HR have been so quick to act? How else would Timothy suddenly turn against me after calling me the love of his life just weeks before? It felt like Oscar had pulled the strings to make sure I lost everything, not just him. He wanted to make sure I was completely ruined. Since then, I've tried everything to reach him. Calls, texts, emails, even showing up at places I thought he might be, but nothing. No response. No acknowledgement. He probably expects me to just quietly sign the divorce papers and move on, to make it all as clean and quick as possible. But I can't. I can't just move on. My life is in ruins. My 5-year marriage, my job, even the house I can't keep because of the prenup. Everything is gone, and I did it to myself. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know how I could have thrown away something so stable, so loving, something anyone would be lucky to have, for a few reckless minutes with someone who didn't even know what he wanted and barely knew what he was doing. I keep replaying it over and over in my head, wishing I'd said no, wishing I'd stayed focused, wishing I'd never picked up that damn phone call. Now I'm stuck with myself and my thoughts. I don't know where to go from here. Is there even any way to fix this? Like, is it even possible to get Oscar back or work in the finance sector ever again? Have I really lost everything for good?